Hello, I'm Vanessa Roberts, and today I'm talking with Peder Jungck of BAE Systems for the Federal News Network series, Delivering the Tech That Delivers for Government, sponsored by Future Tech Enterprise. Welcome, Peder.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm really excited to talk to you. Peder is the Chief Innovation and Strategy Officer for the Intelligence and Security sector at BAE. And today we're going to talk about how a federal systems integrator like BAE continues to push innovation forward, while it's also helping its teams really meet those missions in the government. And you're like the perfect guy to talk about that.
No, this is fabulous. And I think for those that know, I moved to BAE Systems 12 years ago from Silicon Valley, and this whole notion of innovation and invention and kind of the crossover for our federal customers has been key to everything we've done, and that's why we're really excited where we're going.
Well, let's start off talking about that, how you effectively drive that innovation in your operations and your organization, and how that's really helping you better support customers in the federal government.
Yeah, I think now is an incredible time to be talking about innovation. BAE Systems has been innovating and inventing for centuries, longer than most of the defense primes have been around. But really the thing that's changed is the pace of what I would call innovation, which is not necessarily the same as invention. You're leveraging those types of pieces, but really being able to go take and transform them. If you look at things like cloud, it wasn't even about invention, it was about a business model change. It was about really an innovative approach of how do you kind of go put who's deploying capital with these. If we look at our new administration, it's talking about changing that risk equation to who's really kind of invested in those pieces so that it's not the government taking the risk of what might work, but getting to pick out of, like when you think of 100 startups, one works. How do we just go and let the government only take that? And that's really where we're trying to drive this innovation equation. And so we've created a new innovation organization. What that's really done is bring our capabilities teams, all of our thought leaders and technical talent who are still tied into those customers, but bringing them together to really look at not just how do we leverage things like AI, autonomy, automation to do what we used to do, but really transform the way our business is working going forward. And that's really where it's been exciting, because it's not just the technologists. It's often leading with the question of what kind of innovator are you? Right. Like even here, we're connecting people, we're connecting ideas. Those sometimes are as critical of identifying the need and what might be the answer to bring together in a combination. And so that's really where we're trying to, one, define that innovation, and then kind of really bring it very different, but leveraging our invention.
Well, you talked about that pace element, and if you don't bring more people to the table, more people are actually left behind at the pace of the technology now, specifically with AI, right?
Completely. And so as you think about the pace, we have a very different generation. When I joined BAE Systems 12 years ago, it was predominantly this boomer and legacy population. We are now predominantly millennials, Gen Zs. They grew up technologically adept. They don't even remember cassette tapes, things like that. Everything was digital music.
Floppy disks.
Everything was the internet. The dot-com wave, when I think of that was 2000, that was 25 years ago. And that's where a lot of this workforce has always had that type of economy. But they've also had the velocity, just-in-time learning, quick access to things from that. And that's really where we see how do we go in and identify those problems, be able to bring together this massive capabilities, but make it approachable for the people. It's like, how do you make that easy to bring it in? Like we've deployed a capability called Mission Assist internally, which is bringing AI into everybody's desktop. And it's done it in a super easy way where it's just, hey, let me ask this. And you start with that question, like everybody's like, oh my gosh, look at ChatGPT. The first time you ask the question, it's like, but over time, it helps everybody really enter this digital generation.
Right, and allow that pace to continue.
Fully, yeah.
Well, you mentioned three things together. You mentioned automation, AI, and autonomy. Talk about why you are bundling these three technologies and why that's a benefit. I mean, we kind of leaned into it a little, but talk a little more specifically to that, because I think that also leads into this idea of that innovation center that you're talking about.
Yeah, so we have kind of this notion, as you touched on, of what we call our A3 strategy, and that automation. I think a lot of what the last couple decades and things like IT and other types of areas and business process automation, it's really been, let's go take rote drill practice, repeatable type things, automate them, connect one things to the rest. Yeah, sure, we live in a process-oriented culture. Let's go drive those things. Let's bring that automation. But if you're really going to start to unlock something new, that's where you need to tie that to then introducing things like artificial intelligence. Yeah, and artificial intelligence can, recreate, instead of we used to use things like RPA, this robotic process automation. Now we've even evolved to where the LLM can create that automation even better. But it's not just that efficiency, it's about how do you try a new novel outcome. The scale of the AI can try things from a vast variety of means. So it's not just us having a human say, here's how you do it, but you can actually come up with, for the given equation, how best would you automate it? And so if your process didn't automate the same way every time, could it actually unleash something? Whereas if you look at the automation generation, it was really, we defined how first. Now the how gets defined at the question. And that's where the AI plus that does it. The other side is, as we look at some of these key elements of autonomy, I think we've really are starting at the front end of something that we haven't seen, which is this era of digital labor. It is not just that I have a human machine team support assistant, but really, are there things that I could have done instead of myself? Like one of the things we looked at recently is the southern border. There's hundreds of miles of different types of situations. We do not have enough Border Patrol agents. You can put a fleet of autonomous vehicles, for less than the cost of, a single agent. It can do the work of 3 of them, going checking on things, figuring out these different types of parts. How do you not just support a person, but how do you give them access to things to be able to say, hey, maybe you should go over here, maybe you should go there. We're really unlocking them. Or if you put it into our things like our wargaming, it's not just roll the dice 1,000 times. How do you figure the black swan event, as we talk about intelligence, and then provoke it so the team can explore what would you do in those scenarios where you rolled 20 on the dice 59 times in a row. Right. That shouldn't happen, but if it did.
Right.
And so that's really, it's all 3 provoke a new outcome.
Well, it's interesting, one of the things you mentioned, because it made me think recently, I was talking to somebody and they said, think about it, like there may be a point when on your org chart is this agentic agent or this autonomous device that's part of on your management team, right? Because you're managing those in addition to people. It's not that people are going away, you're adding and changing the way that workflow happens. And that's what you're talking about, like really reimagining that in a completely different way than we kind of can almost think of at the moment.
Yeah, and what I would think about in there is, it's not that it's always going to do the same job they did, but how would it provoke it in a new way? Right. Give you an example that would make relevant on the news is we often are reading our articles and seeing out of these, hey, let me get my feed. And we each subscribe in this federal environment to all the different areas like yours that we listen to. But what if the AI every morning said, you know what? I read all of it while you were sleeping. Here's 3 that have very specific things relevant to your internal strategy. The news cycle doesn't know what we're dealing with every day coming in. Well, we think in the past it would have been like our teams all bubbling that up. How do we go do this? But that you can then go say, hey, we should go look at this today. And that's really where, like, even in the last 6 months, if you look at all of us in the defense side, and especially in the services, there's a lot of change. We're able to get from our AI tools today a daily guidance on what everyone in the community is really doing. That is something we didn't have a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. That is some of the things that's helping us actually today.
Well, let's talk, we talked about all the kind of the benefits and the positives and the potential. What are the challenges that you're addressing and that your team's been addressing in kind of doing some of that, integrating that AI and that autonomy, and kind of how you've been addressing them?
I think if you think of the world of, the tech world, where I kind of grew up in, there's building these tools, and it is all about the optimism. For those of us in the federal market, though, it's, okay, how do we deploy it and trust it to achieve these critical missions?
Right. Hit that outcome.
We need to hit the outcome, and it's not just, wow, that looked like a good answer, but we need to understand, how do you manage the pedigree of data? How do you manage that my data doesn't go back? What is the bias of this system based upon how it trained for what way it's going to drive a discussion? You have things, you'll hear words like hallucinating, where kind of the AI kind of makes something up. It sounds good, it's good gibberish, some sort of thing in there.
I pulled these 7 things and I kept to this.
You got it. But how do you get that? How do we put this into an accredited enclave? How do we make sure that then if we have it, it's there? We also have title authorities. We also have these other things to where it can provide you some tips and insight, but we don't trust AI to make our mission critical decisions. We don't want to make sure that it's over biased people to feel confident about it, even when we trust the individuals to do that. And so I think that's really the role of the mission integrators is how do I see these needs? How do I see this promise? But how do I gate and bring in that way to do it? And there's this conflicts of that governance approach with the velocity of how do I run this and really win this AI race? And I think that's what's been exciting for us. That's where kind of as an organization, it's like, hey, we've learned these lessons in deploying AI for more than a decade in these federal IT systems. How do we really do the velocity as it's shifting the labor force?
Right, you have to show that you can do it and that you've had success on your own when you're trying to then go into a government agency and convince them.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think this is a perfect spot to take a quick break. We'll be right back with Peder Jungck. He's the Chief Innovation and Strategy Officer for the Intelligence and Security Sector at BAE Systems. Welcome back. I'm Vanessa Roberts, and I'm talking with BAE's Peder Jungck. Let's get back to it, shall we?
Wonderful.
So before this, we were kind of talking about challenges and those type of things. And another challenge, obviously, and runs through everything, is cybersecurity. It's a must, especially in the work that you're doing in most of the agencies that you work with, and really all of the agencies that you work with. So let's talk about that and how you really ensure that identity and access management, especially today. We've talked about like the change and then like kind of digital natives that now work in these environments, but everybody's mobile too, and people need things out at the edge. How are you looking at that, and how are you thinking about it, not just within the confines of this country, but maybe worldwide for a lot of these customers?
The cyber landscape is shifting in a number of ways. And as you mentioned, we've gone from this world of bad passwords and, hey, you're the admin, so you get access to everything, to this zero trust type environment. The great thing is, I believe our government understands how to do this. That's what I was part of for a lot of it, and even building some of my companies, on how do we do that cybersecurity to this next level. I don't know that everybody realizes how fundamentally different, though, the zero trust approach is. You still have a lot of vendors thinking that I'm going to sell you a widget and we accomplish zero trust. I'm like, I don't think you've gotten the emphasis or the insight to what the government's meaning. The other thing is when you talk about things like identity, this is where we're going from simple identity management to that IDAM, identity access management world, plus access, kind of based access control, fine-grained access controls, to really back to this fundamentals that several administrations ago used to talk, Al Tarasic talking about tag the user, tag the data. Every single piece of data, you should be able to understand kind of what is its pedigree, what is its role, who should be able to have access to that, not just based upon the role, but even in the teams. Only you and I should have the notes to the specific with maybe the studio audience to this, not just, okay, you seem trustworthy, come in the building. You could get that. And I think that's really where, when you look at the identity, we're moving to this ICAM, credentials access management type world, where it's every little piece done in there. I don't think everybody's gotten there, or that it's a continuous effort to continuously reevaluate how we're doing it, or that many of our products don't work that way. Some of the hardest things we've had in deploying the sensitive networks has been upon how do you really get that enforced when the tools we live in don't really work that way. Yeah. And so that's where we're often having to create these spider webs, and hopefully out of the innovation and just the all of government focus on zero trust, we can get there. And so that's a lot of the best practices we're bringing together inside, is how to do that. And then how do you unlock really the promise of it, which is, continuously reassessing your infrastructure, not just saying it was there at a moment. Right. That was one of the journeys we went on for CMMC, as kind of we were the first of the large primes to actually have our full backbone network done. Lots of people did edge and enclaves, but we live in it all day, every day. Part of what that did is it had all of us really understand how different is it to live in this future state to really start getting to that type of credentialed world.
There were a couple things you mentioned. One, that idea that a lot of the technology doesn't, in essence, think that way, like zero trust, right? Like getting over that hurdle. And that's not just a hurdle on the inside for like your business, but it's also the hurdle for the government too, correct? Like getting the technology so it can actually plug and play with different varieties of zero trust technology elements that you need, right? Because you need more than one.
Completely. And it's often the kind of the recipe of how you put the parts together. Like we have things in our network that simply validate your user and who you are, and whether it's a password or whether it's two-factor. You have things that are called like Active Directory servers that kind of say have that. Right. But in most of these networks, the machines are tracked in that, the applications are tracked in that, and the users. But if you look into the basis of some of our high assurance security controls, you actually have to start to go to multiple. Sometimes we'll call them things like forests. Some of these networks, you have to break that up into 9 different systems. That is not something you can iterate to. You have to go in and unroll everything, stage it. And that's where it's not so much that the server or the tool changed, but the design patterns are having to change, much like NSA used to roll out a lot of their kind of micro-segmentation.
Right, the micro-segmentation.
Separate it. It's like my kids can't surf anywhere because the TVs are on a totally different Wi-Fi in the house than something else, because we're like, we're going to do it at home so that my TV can't attack my PC. Those types of design patterns take a very different type. And that's really where we've been trying to drive our kind of repeatable ones. We run place by place. Here's how it's been validated. Right. To get there, because it coming different. And I think it's really that journey of zero trust. How do you continuously implement it? It's as opposed to in the past, we were very much technology. Even companies I'd built were more, here's a tech to do a thing.
Right. And that also goes back to our discussion in the first part with the potential and with the innovation, because that's where you have the issue of the data and the ability to use it for that innovation and to apply these newer technologies to that data. I mean, kind of because of the issue you're talking about, in a lot of instances, that's why things are like, just classify it all, right? And then that doesn't allow you to take advantage of the data because there's parts of it that don't need to be classified, or it only needs to be classified for certain tiers, right?
But this is where the volume of data is at such a large scale. Right. You can't use kind of humans to necessarily tag and do everything in there. That's where we're using the AI, the automation, to really allow us to go through there. You put that in there, and as you add accessibility, there becomes a threat surface. That is where our adversaries are using these AI tools to be able to see the surface area change of a new patch, a new piece of software, every one at that velocity. If we can't make our cybersecurity defense run at the same velocity of the attackers or faster, you're never going to be able to go and defend this and be able to really take advantage of the data economy that we've got. And that's really where we're trying to go drive in there. I think that's what's the unique role of organizations like ours, is to where we can go bring those recipes for the customer, that they're not just the first. It's not just let's see if this works. There's lots of tech tools and wizardry people say there, but here's the proven ways we can allow this continuous insertion of capabilities. Things like modular ATOs, continuous authority to operate, those types of things. How do you put them in practice? Right. And that's why we have to draw upon those tools of AI, automation, and autonomy.
It's the 2 parallel innovation paths that have to keep moving forward and also be interconnected.
And it's really, to simplify it, and probably overly, today we're having talent that is engaging in making critical decisions. How do you just accelerate that pace? That A3 I talked about is really just allowing us to have at your side, kind of 7, extra helpers. So think if every lead engineer had 7 deputies at their side. That is what we're talking about, digital labor coming alongside them to give this power. Because you still have to make choices, and that way it can pop up and say, hey, here's 3 things, you better make the call. So that instead of spending your time doing the minutia, and this is where when we talk to our teams, they're spending 50, 60% of their time filling out a form. I've gone and hardened this, I've put all the logs in there, I've documented everything within my Visio charts, but I have to go put it in this template online. How do you simply transcribe it from one to the other? Don't make a choice, don't change this, and then just go see, is the document the same, is it there? Those are the types of things where we're like, hey, I can take that workload off. And what we're seeing is it's also exciting the senior talent in our organization going, oh, this is awesome, because I'm not having to do all those other things. It's like we all cringed as a software programmer when I did that. I'm like, how are we going to document it? Now you can get instantaneous documentation and read it and say, is it good?
Well, talk about that compliance piece again a little bit more, because we leaned into it a little bit. You mentioned Zero Trust, you mentioned CMMC, but talk about that and that management piece. And I think that's directly connected to what you're also saying about filling out all these forms, doing all this work. Like, there's a perspective there that actually can really help the government and the vendors who work with the government, right? Because that AI and that autonomy can really help them.
Yeah, and if you think about, when we're as humans and people, we're trying to say, what is the 3 pieces of information that I can really wrap my head around to really make sure I can make a good decision? And we're always trying to reduce the data set to, okay, if I'm going to read one book, what would be that book that would help me see the future? AI is the opposite. The more data that it gets, the more it can find, and it can say, hey, I will look through everything and find that one outlier to kind of raise to that piece. What we're talking about is changing this equation, because when you think of governance and compliance, it was, we spend all this time designing something. Here's a zero trust, capable cyber system, as if it's a moment in time. We're going to then have documented for 3 months, so now it's 3 months old. Here's how it is, and then we're going to put it into some system and hope over the next 6 months the people supporting our government folks can determine that, yes, that's the right thing. We need to be in this place to where here is the current state as it is. Sure, put it into a form in those systems so it's documented and it's there, but the government should have the tools to be able to go assess. Is it really there? Was your update introducing something risky? Should I say, hey, I get that you updated that compliance, but then why don't we open up new things like, let's continually test that. Let's go look and say, you know what, you submitted your documents, according to this team it sounds good, but 4 other teams documented a risk in a different part of government that, let's go assess if you have that vulnerability. These are things where we're like, how do I unlock this place to where you're at a much higher level of this so that you're outrunning that adversary? Because that adversary is seeing all of our surface areas. They're bigging up a technique and they're going, this group's prepared, that one's not. That's really where we're trying to catalyze, to use this to unlock. And while we've all talked about technology doing this, it has only been in the last 18 months you're truly getting crossover. I've been waiting for this to come forever. Wrote code on neural networks to do this type of AI in the 80s and the computers would crash. Now we have it. And I think that's the difference. And I'm not sure everybody appreciates we're at a fundamental crossover.
Right. I think you just told me what I was going to just ask you, which is like, what's your crystal ball of what's coming? But you kind of just said it. But maybe just before we wrap, like, crystallize for the audience from our conversation, like, what you really are super excited about and what you're working on right this second, and what you kind of see just a little bit down the road coming.
So I am excited for the change and the opportunity. I would say for many years, we've pushed our teams to create innovative ideas, and there's often been resistance. Our market is changing to where there is an openness for, hey, how could we do this better? We have demand signals of, kind of watching kind of other countries do things that we need to advance our posture to be able to continue to have the freedoms we have, that we can now deploy these capabilities, and people are asking for, how do I go faster? And so first and foremost, that is that broadest piece. I think the other side is that we have a workforce that is digital natives now. We've been waiting for decades for a digital native one. I grew up in that arcade generation, and it was like always saying, wait, when leadership gets there, well, guess, from senior leadership all the way down, we're digital natives, and the digital has caught up. And that is really where kind of this notion of digital labor and the rest are not just some thought in the future. You are seeing news report after news report of, hey, things like patch management, which used to be hard in cybersecurity, it just works. You can automate 10,000 machines, and as the data comes in, and assess them and red team them. And so every morning, here's your red team impacts of what you got to go fix. We are in a totally different economy. Some will make it, some will not. But why I moved to the Valley to be a venture capitalist was you look for market disruption, and I'm going, oh my gosh, it is here. It is exciting.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Peter. Thanks for coming and talking in studio with me today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
And thank you to our audience for joining us too. I'm Vanessa Roberts, and my guest today has been Peder Jungck, the Chief Innovation and Strategy Officer for the Intelligence and Security Sector at BAE Systems. To learn more about enterprise infrastructure best practices, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Future Tech Enterprise. Have a great day and see you soon on federalnewsnetwork.com.